Hey, Jake Williams from Rendition InfoSec here. Wanted to do a quick walkthrough of a report that is making the rounds on this new destructive attack discovered by destructive cyber attack discovered by the Saudi National Cybersecurity Authority, or NCA. And although they don't directly attribute this to Iran, looking at some of the indicators, it's pretty obvious that it's Iranian. I say pretty obvious, right? I mean, as obvious as it gets that it's Iranian in any case. We wanted to walk through some of the data in the technical report. So I'll link the technical report basically link that in the video, hopefully, and I wanted to quickly walk through a couple of pieces of the report. You probably remember that Saudi Aramco was targeted with the Shamoon virus many years ago. Here we have effectively this new malware, Dustman, that was detonated on December 29th. Now, I think it's important to note that while I'm sure there's some folks that are going to throw some illusory correlation out there and say, well, it must be related to the killing of Soleimani, I'll also ask you to do some temporal analysis and note that December 29th, 2019 is before January 3rd, 2020, so no. That said, it does kind of support the TTP, the kind of that tradecraft or playbook of Iran to perform destructive cyber attacks. A couple of things to note, right? First off, they do use the same, both Shamoon and Dustman use the same third-party device driver, LDOS raw disk. That's not the only piece of malware that we've seen this driver in, but it is significant. It's also worth noting that that's an unsigned device driver, and so as a result, the Iranian attackers need a way ultimately to get that device driver loaded. We'll talk about how they do that as well, and also notes that while there's been some publication on what's being called this zero clear malware, that Dustman is considered to be a new variant of that. Right, so IBM X-Force has published, and again, links down here in the kind of in the report, notes that Dustman is probably a new variant of zero clear. I'll tell you that having taken a quick look at the malware myself, I would agree with that assessment. I don't think there's a whole lot of argument around that assessment itself. Let's talk quickly about the attack lifecycle, because I think this is probably the more important point as far as how do they get in. We're already seeing a lot of this with ransomware, where again, the attackers are getting in through unpatched VPN services. It could be Pulse Secure again here, unspecified, I believe, which VPN provider it was. But again, we're seeing a lot of this regardless. They're then using the VPN to access the network, gain credentials, laterally move, and then basically delete your tracks or cover your tracks, right? So they talk about the VPN server, but they don't talk about which one as far as initial access goes. Again, I think Pulse Secure is a not unreasonable thought here, but it's hard to say, right? I think probably one of the most important points here is number 2.4, noting weaponization. Dustman malware was compiled, again, minutes before deploying it in the victim's network. Now, every executable has an embedded timestamp, an embedded compilation timestamp, and again, that it was basically compiled minutes before, or at least indications are based on the timestamp that it was compiled minutes before. Again, it shows that these attackers, or would seem to indicate that the attackers, are reasonably complex, right? Again, at this point, if it's custom compile or a one-off compile, there's obviously not a known MD5 sum or known SHA-1 or whatever floating around for this, again, fairly inconsistent with normal destructive attacks, because usually they are tested, or tools are tested before being deployed. Now, I think it's worth noting that zero clear itself has been extensively tested, and if Dustman is merely a new build of this or modification of this, it's likely the testing has already happened as well. But again, here, brand new build, never before seen by antivirus. Of course, that can be a blessing or a curse when it comes to reputational. But the one thing for sure is that there's no signature specifically for that, or not by hash anyway, for that. So installation. So the threat actor accessed the victim's network and copied the malware, as well as the tool psexec, right? And by the way, note here that they actually compromised the antivirus console server. It doesn't specify which antivirus, but wow, wouldn't you love to know, right? So anyway, finds the antivirus server, and really what the key here is that the antivirus console server can talk to everything, right? So now I'll mention that we've worked incident responses in the past where the antivirus management console has actually been used as a propagation tool. That does not appear to be the case here, right? Again, every indication here is that psexec was used to laterally move through the network, and that antivirus console server was simply means to an end in that basically in that it has open network connections, even if they have good network segmentation, good firewalling between VLANs. Again, this is very likely a server that can talk to everything. And while you could argue that segmentation could be performed in a way that doesn't require SMB communications, which again used by psexec, or SMB and RPC used by psexec. Again, I would note that most networks don't do that, right? It's also significant to note that the attacker accessed the storage servers, and I'm going to assume here filers. Again, they don't specify, but let's assume like a NetApp or an EMC or something along those lines, filers. And at that point, they're basically accessing the storage servers and deleting all the volumes manually. We've seen this in destructive cyber attacks, including in some ransomware attacks, which is really, really interesting, where attackers have just said, hey, feel the pain, you're not getting these files back, but suck it, right, kind of thing. And so basically the idea being that maybe the filers have better backups, or better backups online with the filer itself. In any case, we see psexec being actually, let me come back to that. I said in any case. Let me come back to this for a second here. Again, they're accessing these storage servers. Let's assume that if they're able to go delete volumes manually, they have admin on the storage servers. There is a good argument to be made that even if you need to join those storage servers to a domain, whoever has administrative control of those, maybe that shouldn't be a domain joined account, or should require some other than domain authentication. All right, so some out-of-band account for the creation or deletion of volumes, whereas obviously LDAP and domain access are needed for access to files. From a domain perspective, there probably is a better way, or I say probably is a better way. Best practices at this point dictate you separating the out-of-band management, like volume creation and destruction, required to really separate that out. So the attackers execute a set of commands in the antivirus management console and basically distribute malware to connected machines. This is done via psexec, right? Okay, so and most of the machines connected end up getting wiped, unsurprisingly, because this is a destructive cybersecurity attack, or destructive cyber attack. And after the wiping mission's accomplished, the attacker logs into the VPN server. Remember, this is their initial access through the VPN server. They deleted the most recent VPN access logs, and then they went ahead and used off-the-shelf anti-forensics tools, right, file deletion tools, to help cover their tracks, right? Now, I think it's kind of interesting where they're like, it indicates the threat actor failed a few wipes on some systems, and we're trying to clean any artifacts left on those systems. Obviously, again, I don't have the forensic data to support or argue this assertion here, but I will mention that it's probably well, I don't know. I shouldn't say probably anything. Who knows at the end of the day? I'm not sure that the download based on what we see here, purely based on what we see here, not sure that the download of a third-party wiping tool supports the conclusion that the threat actor failed a few wipes and we're trying to clean artifacts left on those systems. But what I do take away from this, regardless, is definitely that you have an actor that's performing anti-forensics, right? And so, if we talk about logging to the VPN server and deleting recent VPN access logs, if you've got a SIEM, Security Information Event Management System, this shouldn't be an issue, right? You should have a secondary log storage device. We're forwarding those logs to another device, and that puts the attacker in a bad position here for trying to wipe those files, right? So I wanted to kind of throw that out there as another, just as another note, that could be that is a TTP that we're seeing used consistently, and again, remember that we do attribute this attack to the government of Iran, or to attackers operating on behalf of the government of Iran. So note, obviously, with the heightened alert around the possibility of Iranian cyber attacks, it is significant to note that in an attack just over a week old, or just over a week ago, that we are watching attackers take, basically take anti-forensic steps to cover their tracks, right? And so if you are involved later in an Iranian cyber attack, or honestly any APT attack for that matter, just be cognizant of the possibility of anti-forensics, or probability of anti-forensics tampering, right? Okay, so as far as the Dustman, basically the Dustman analysis, the actual malware itself, it's important to note over here TDL, right? So the Turla driver loader. Now, sometimes TDL means other things to other folks, but rock on TDL. Why do we call this the Turla driver loader, or why are they referencing the Turla driver loader? Basically, what's happening here is there's this technique was originally piloted. I believe the first place we ever saw it was APT28, if I remember correctly. Effectively, the way that they were able to load a rootkit driver in Windows 64-bit, Vista and later, they basically prevent, or Microsoft prevents, the loading of unsigned device drivers. And this is supposed to be an anti-rootkit kind of technology there, or at least to prevent rootkits from getting in the kernel in the first place. It turns out that attackers very quickly figured out, the Turla group did, initially at least, figured out that they could basically bring along a vulnerable signed device driver to the basically to the attack, and by bringing that along, they would deploy that. Windows will load that device driver because it's signed, right? A very popular one, and the one that's being used here, they talk about a little bit later, is basically Oracle's, VirtualBox, owned by Oracle now, but VirtualBox disk driver, right? So this vboxdisk.sys is one that we see quite a bit in a number of different intrusions, and it's because it is a legitimately signed device driver. The certificate is used for a lot of legitimate software inside of VirtualBox. It's not the kind of thing that can easily be revoked, and as a result, we'll be dealing with this for years to come. And so what we have here effectively then is that this device driver is loaded and then is exploited using a trivial buffer overflow. Once it's exploited with that trivial buffer overflow, basically at that point then there's kernel shellcode that's loaded, and now with that kernel shellcode, it turns out that they can then basically bootstrap the unsigned device driver code into memory, right? So okay, so basically here, the fact that this is posted on GitHub doesn't really mean anything specifically, other than, yes, it's easier for folks now to get this capability, but this is a capability that's been around for several years, right? Several years. So Dustman. Again, they mention appears to be a new variant of ZeroClear, but again, the same raw disk driver is, by the way, commercial raw disk driver is used. Again, it has the same fingerprint as ZeroClear. Again, I'm kind of in the mode of there's a lot more that kind of ties those together once you start diving into the malware. But again, it definitely shares fingerprints with both Dustman shares fingerprints with both ZeroClear as well as other basically other malware that's used, that definitely that Turla driver loading technique of exploiting that VirtualBox disk driver. All right, so okay, rock on. Kind of coming down a little bit here to technical analysis. Notice here the assistant.sys, they don't actually name it that vboxdisk.sys, but there are some indications, well, in addition to downloading and looking, looking at that assistant.sys here is, again, you can kind of see Dustman is dropping here. The wiper itself runs in user space, and then basically points to that raw disk driver, that commercially available raw but unsigned raw disk driver, and then assistant.sys, again, that this is only used to basically bootstrap the loading of that raw disk driver into memory. They do mention a Mutex, but fail to mention specifically what the Mutex is. That's something that I need to go grab at a technical analysis on our side. But note here that checks if VirtualBox service is running on the system, and says if it's running, the malware, of course, is going to try to stop it. Right? It also goes and looks for the basically the registry key for VirtualBox in the registry. As you can imagine, most of your systems probably are not running VirtualBox. I have lots of feels about that in general, and VirtualBox software in general, but rock on. At that point, then it extracts out the vulnerable driver resource system.sys, decrypts it, and writes the decrypted resource ultimately, basically, directly to the dropper. And again, we're looking here at that dustman.exe. Notice over here that they are actually looking for basically that VBox VirtualBox driver. And by the way, too, even though you name this system.sys, it's still going to load up. Basically, there's a driver object that's going to be created, and you're registering a service name along with that. And so anyway, TLDR, even though it's named as system.sys, that's why you're seeing VBox drive up here. And again, ultimately use a shellcode to go exploit that vulnerable signed driver from VirtualBox and then load the raw driver in. Right? So I'm not going to cover every bit of this because it doesn't really matter at the end of the day. Ultimately here, note that one of the things that is worth noting is that for every volume, every logical volume on the system, ultimately that agent.exe is being run, and they point it to basically to a volume name, basically for each volume that should be wiped. Right? Anyway, let's see, what else did I want to discuss here? Not much, to be honest. Indicators of compromise, bravo that that IOCs are being provided. I also have to mention here that the Saudi NCA, I'm not going to go through a bunch of preventive measures here because that's basic. Don't let attackers on your system and stop them from migrating and all that stuff. And anyway, what I will mention here is that bravo to NCA, and I don't think I've pictured myself ever saying those words, but bravo to NCA for publishing YARA rules. I will mention that I think these YARA rules are a little bit overly verbose. Almost looks like they maybe use a generator to write these, but hey, again, not complaining because they come with YARA rules, and that's a pretty big deal here. The LRAW disk.sys one in particular, I think this one's probably one worth keeping in mind for the long term, because again, we've seen it used in multiple different attacks over the years, different ransomware, as well as assistant.sys. Remember, this is the VirtualBox disk driver, and you can even see this here, right? VBox drive, VBoxDRV.pdb. PDB, for those that don't know, is a program, basically the program debug file, and so you can see here that string still appears in that assistant.sys. It's really odd to me that they basically include all the details around here about what it is, but keep referring to it as, quote, just like a generic third-party device driver kind of thing. But hey, whatever, rock on. Okay, so all that, and again, also probably worth noting here too is that they use the import hash feature of the PE module in YARA to possibly get a little bit better signatures. But you'll note here that I don't know. I'm kind of back to I see the potential for, well, whatever. I'll shut up about the YARA rules. I could see a lot of, a lot of stuff run there. Also worth noting here, as far as where does Dustman get its name from? Notice the PDB file there in basically, or the PDB file for basically for the agent.exe. And you can see here then indeed that Dustman is part of the path, right? And so that kind of helps, or at least from helps a little bit for understanding like where did it get its name from. Anyway, so that's really all that I've got on this, but I wanted to walk through, I say all I've got. I'm basically reviewing a technical report because we don't have the original, we don't have obviously the original incident response details. From a malware standpoint, we'll probably do a little bit more reversing on this over the next couple of days. We have our own incident responses that we're working, as well, but just to get a better understanding of this and maybe clean up some of these YARA rules a little bit. That said, and this is a pretty good technical report, and again, I applaud Saudi NCA for sharing this, and honestly too, it comes at a pretty important time when we are absolutely looking at comes at a pretty important time. We're absolutely looking at a heightened risk of destructive cyber attack from Iran. Looking at again the workflow of how the attackers compromise the system. I'm trying to pull that back up here. There we go. Looking at the workflow of how the attackers compromised the system and laterally moved, I think is an important story to tell, particularly because again we are presently at a heightened risk of destructive cyber attack from Iranian hackers or those that are sympathetic to Iran. All right, so anyway, I'll go ahead and close there. But if you have any questions, of course, feel free to reach out. I'm pretty easy to find. Malware Jake on Twitter and RenditionSec on Twitter. If you need assistance from a cybersecurity standpoint, by all means, feel free to reach out to Rendition InfoSec 888-409-5811. And we'll be more than happy to help. Again, I'll tell you that I'm just not going to review, at least not in this video anyway, all the recommendations from Saudi NCA for mitigating this kind of attack. But I will mention that we run a 24/7 security ops center, and for outsourced SOC work, and that's something that we obviously detect a lot of attacks early, and prevent the spread. We also do security architecture work where we help basically help put roadblocks in place for ultimately for attackers, so that they make noise as they try to laterally move throughout a network. And anywho, it's probably worth walking through at some point some of the defensive measures that you can take around this. I'll belay that for you for a future video though, and just say peace out. So anyway, enjoy. Jake Williams from Rendition InfoSec, signing off.